He rejected every woman who came into his life until fate brought him face to face with the poor girl sleeping at a bus stop. Welcome back to LessonLit, where we bring you emotional love stories that will touch your heart and keep you hooked until the very end. The city of Boston gleamed with its usual mixture of glass towers and old brick facades, but to Alexander Reed, none of it mattered. At 28, he sat at the top of Reed Enterprises, a corporation spread across continents, built on numbers, acquisitions, and an unforgiving precision that matched its master. Alexander was the kind of man who seemed carved from marble, every detail of his life polished, calculated, and under control. He had no time for distractions, least of all for the foolishness of love. He had rejected it again and again, lavish proposals from wealthy families, half-veiled seductions at society events, even the occasional bold attempt from employees who thought wealth could be seduced into tenderness. His answer had always been the same: no. The millionaire who never wavered, who never faltered, who needed no one. That was the reputation Alexander carried, and for years he had worn it like armor. But that night, as winter crept through the veins of the city, he found himself stepping out of the warmth of an exclusive restaurant and into the sharp bite of the cold. His driver had already pulled the sleek black car up to the curb, but Alexander walked alone toward it, his long coat brushing against the pavement. The streets were quiet, emptied by the bitter air. And then, as he turned the corner past an almost deserted bus stop, he stopped. The bench there was hardly visible under the weak glow of the flickering street lamp. Curled on one end of it, like some fragile figure abandoned by the world, was a young woman. Her body was folded against the chill, her knees drawn close to her chest, and a thin coat clung desperately to her shoulders. A stack of papers, messy and wrinkled, slipped from her tired hands. Résumés, by the look of them. She was shivering, though asleep, her lips parted in uneven breaths, as if even dreaming offered no peace. Alexander should have kept walking. That was what logic demanded, what the disciplined man in him commanded. Women had always been drawn to his name, his fortune, his face that magazines described with exhausting praise. He never allowed it to matter. They had nothing to offer beyond fleeting attention, nothing he wanted. Yet something in this nameless girl struck him like a sudden chord of music long forgotten. A face pale in the dim light, strands of hair tangled across her cheek, hands trembling faintly against the night wind, and an ache stirred in his chest, sharp and unfamiliar. He stood there, unmoving, the city muted around him. A memory whispered at the edges of his mind, blurred and ungraspable, as though her fragile outline belonged to another time he could not recall. He did something then he did not plan. Slowly, Alexander slipped his heavy wool coat from his shoulders. It was warm, thick, and carried the faint, restrained fragrance he wore every day. He laid it carefully over the girl, adjusting it so her shoulders were covered, so her shivers might ease. Still, he didn't move. His hand brushed the worn edges of the papers she clutched, and he placed them back in her lap before they could scatter in the wind. Then, as though pulled by an invisible thread, Alexander reached into his inner pocket. His fingers closed around a small wooden box, dark, carved with patterns worn by time. The music box he had carried for years without knowing why, a relic from a childhood blurred by wealth, tutors, and eventual loneliness. He never spoke of it, never showed it to anyone. Yet tonight, he placed it on the bench beside the girl as if it belonged with her. For a long breath, he simply looked at her, the street lamp painting shadows over her quiet face. His heart was beating differently now, not the steady mechanical rhythm he trusted, but erratic, uneven. He did not like it. It unsettled him in ways he could not explain. The man who prided himself on iron control had been moved by the sight of a stranger at a bus stop. Finally, Alexander turned and walked to the waiting car. His driver greeted him, but he said nothing. As the city passed in blurred lights outside the tinted window, he leaned back, closing his eyes. He felt the absence of his coat on his shoulders, the missing weight of the music box in his pocket, and an image lingered with startling clarity. A girl sleeping against the cold, wrapped in his coat, holding his forgotten melody. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed wondered if perhaps he did need someone after all. The night air carried a sharp edge as Boston wound down, but Emily Carter's mind was too restless to notice the cold. She clutched her worn backpack against her chest as the bus rattled along uneven streets, the mysterious coat folded over her lap, the wooden music box pressed tightly in her hand. She had played it once, and the melody still lingered in her veins, haunting, delicate, the kind of tune that felt like it belonged not to her ears, but to her soul. Every note had pressed on a memory she couldn't fully recall, and yet it hurt in a way that almost felt good, like touching a scar and knowing you had survived it. She whispered a name without realizing it. Josh! The syllables trembled on her lips, a name that meant nothing to her present life, but somehow everything to the lost corners of her heart. She shook her head quickly, embarrassed even in her own company, and tucked the music box deep inside her bag. It was too much, too strange, too heavy to think about now. What mattered was tomorrow. Another day of job interviews, another day of rejection she had to steel herself to face. Across the city, Alexander Reed leaned against the cold glass wall of his penthouse, staring out at the glittering sprawl below. To the world, he was untouchable. A billionaire CEO who built empires with ruthless precision, a man courted by women of status and beauty, every one of whom he had dismissed with an unshakable icebound heart. Love was a distraction, a liability, a word for weaker men. That was the creed he lived by. But tonight, something in him was breaking. He kept replaying the sight of her, curled on a bench under a flickering streetlight, trembling from the cold yet clutching her papers like they were the last proof of her existence. It should have been nothing. A stranger on the street, a detail erased by the next day's board meeting. And yet, he had covered her with his coat. He had left her the music box he carried everywhere but never touched. His chest still felt lighter, emptier without them, as though he had surrendered pieces of himself he didn't even know he'd been guarding. "Why?" he muttered to the darkened glass. His reflection looked back at him, polished, cold, unreadable. But the question would not leave. Why her? Why tonight? Why that melody echoing faintly in his memory, as if he'd heard it once before, long ago? He pressed his hands against the window, trying to ground himself, but the sensation that something in his life had shifted refused to let go. The next morning, Boston resumed its rhythm. Coffee carts steaming, hurried feet pounding sidewalks, ambition filling the air like oxygen. Emily walked through it all, the coat folded neatly in her arms. She couldn't bring herself to wear it, not when its fabric whispered wealth and elegance so foreign to her world. Instead, she carried it carefully, like proof of a miracle she didn't understand. Her destination rose above her like a cathedral of glass and steel, Reed Enterprises. She had heard of it before, everyone had, but to her it was not a corporation or a symbol. It was a chance, a slim one, but better than none. Inside the lobby, she felt suddenly small, swallowed by marble floors, gold accents, and the hushed authority that made every sound echo. She approached the receptionist with her resume, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I'm applying for the night cleaning shift," she said. The paper was stamped, filed away, and her existence dismissed in a single practiced gesture. She turned to leave, forcing herself not to feel the sting. The elevator chimed then, releasing a cluster of executives laughing among themselves. She stepped aside, nearly colliding with a tall man moving in the opposite direction. For a moment their eyes met, and her breath caught. He looked at her as though he knew her, truly knew her, past and present both, yet she had never seen him before in her life. She mumbled an apology and hurried toward the revolving doors. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being seen, not by a stranger, but by someone who mattered. Alexander stood rooted where she'd brushed against him, his pulse betraying him again. It was her, the girl from the bench. In the bright light of morning, she looked different, alert, determined, alive with the quiet fire of someone who had learned how to endure disappointment without collapsing, but it was unmistakable. Her. He watched her slip through the doors, watched her vanish into the crowd, and the control he had built his empire upon trembled once more. Later that afternoon, when Margaret brought him the day's intake of new hires, he didn't tell her why he wanted them. He only scanned the pages until he saw the name that already felt carved into him. Emily Carter. Cleaner, night shift. His lips moved around the name, silent, reverent. He could summon her into his world with a single command. He could erase the boundaries between their lives, but he didn't. Not yet. The truth was too large, too dangerous, and he was not ready to face what it meant. That night, as silence replaced the city's daytime thunder, Alexander found himself on the 24th floor, wandering corridors he had not walked in years. He told himself it was routine inspection, yet when he heard the faint squeak of a cartwheel, his heart betrayed him again. He turned a corner, and there she was, hair pulled into a bun, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused on her task. Emily looked up, startled, then smiled politely. "Good evening," she said. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed, the man who claimed he needed no one, forgot his carefully built distance. "Good evening," he replied, and his voice carried a warmth he had thought long buried. And just like that, the millionaire who had rejected every woman without hesitation found himself powerless in the presence of the one who had never even looked his way. The 24th floor was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the squeak of Emily's cleaning cart wheels rolling against the marble. Midnight had swallowed most of the building, but Alexander Reed hadn't gone home. He stood in the shadows of his office, staring at spreadsheets he wasn't reading, waiting for something he couldn't explain, or rather, someone. He told himself he was restless, that he needed to check late reports, but the truth pressed harder against his chest. He wanted to see her again, the girl from the bus stop, the girl in his coat, the girl whose name he had discovered in a hiring report. Emily Carter. Through the glass walls of his office, he saw her pass, head bowed, hair tied back in a messy bun, her uniform sleeves rolled above her elbows. She was humming softly to herself, unaware anyone was watching. Something ordinary, something human, yet it cut through him like the first sunlight after years of storm. He stepped into the hallway. Emily froze when she noticed him, her rag midair, her eyes wide. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she gave a polite half-smile. "Good evening, sir." Her voice was soft but steady, and it unsettled him. He was used to people stumbling over their words in his presence, trembling under the weight of his authority. Yet this young woman, exhausted, overworked, carrying the scent of cleaning soap on her skin, looked him in the eyes without flinching. "Good evening," he replied, his voice lower than usual, almost rough. Emily tilted her head, studying him. "I think I've seen you around before. You work late a lot, don't you?" Alexander hesitated. To tell the truth, that he was the CEO of Reed Enterprises would break whatever fragile thread connected them. For reasons he couldn't explain, he wasn't ready. "Yes," he said finally. "You could say that. I check on things." "Maintenance?" she asked lightly, trying to fill the silence. He nodded once. The lie tasted strange, but he let it stay. Emily smiled, a real smile this time, small but warm. "Well, I'm still new. If you notice I've missed a spot, don't be too harsh on me, all right? I'm still learning." Alexander's lips curved almost against his will. The most feared man in Boston's corporate towers, smiling in the middle of a deserted hallway at midnight because a cleaner had teased him. He murmured something that almost sounded like agreement, then stepped aside to let her pass. But as she rolled the cart away, he stayed rooted, his chest tight. That night, he couldn't leave. He wandered the floors until he heard something unexpected. Music. Faint, hesitant at first, then clearer, spilling through the silence like a secret meant only for those who dared listen. Alexander followed the sound, drawn as if by invisible wires. The trail led him to the break room on the 21st floor. The door was ajar, light spilling into the hallway. Inside, Emily sat at an old upright piano tucked into the corner. Her fingers moved across the keys with surprising grace, coaxing out a melody Alexander knew too well. He stopped breathing. It was the song. The very one the music box had carried for decades, the one tied to a part of his past he had long buried. She played it without hesitation, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips parted in quiet awe as if she too didn't understand why her hands knew the notes so well. The tune was haunting, familiar, and achingly beautiful. When she finished, she sat back with a shaky laugh. "Why do I even know this song?" she whispered to herself. Alexander stepped into the room before he could think better of it. His shadow fell across the floor. Emily startled, turning quickly, her cheeks flushed. "Oh, I didn't know anyone was there. Sorry, I guess I needed a distraction." "You play that song," Alexander said slowly, his voice unsteady. "Why?" Emily blinked, confused by the intensity in his eyes. "I don't know. It feels like I've known it forever, like a dream you half remember when you wake up." She laughed nervously. "Weird, right?" His throat tightened. He wanted to tell her everything. How that melody had followed him since childhood, how the music box had been the one fragile piece of his past he couldn't let go of. But he stayed silent. His secrets were bars in a cage he didn't yet know how to break. Instead, he stepped closer. "It's not weird. Some things stay with us even when we don't understand why." Emily studied him for a moment, then shifted on the bench. "Want to try?" she asked, patting the seat beside her. Alexander hesitated. He hadn't sat at a piano in years, but something in her gaze disarmed him, pulling him forward until he sat beside her. Their shoulders brushed lightly. His fingers touched the keys, uncertain at first, then firmer as muscle memory returned. He began a simple harmony. Emily's smile grew as she joined in. Together they played, their notes weaving into something whole. Two strangers, yet not strangers at all. When the last note faded, Emily laughed softly. "You're not bad for a maintenance guy." Alexander turned his head, watching the brightness in her eyes, the ease in her laughter. For a man who had rejected the world for 28 years, the realization hit with terrifying force. He wanted more of this. More of her. But before he could speak, Emily glanced at the clock and jumped up. "Oh no, I'm late for my rounds. If Linda catches me slacking, I'll be scrubbing floors till next year." She grabbed her rag, gave him one last smile, and hurried out. Alexander remained at the piano, staring at the empty bench beside him, his hands still trembling from the keys. For the first time in years, the walls around his heart cracked, and he couldn't shake the haunting truth. The girl who played that song was the key to a past he had tried to forget, and the future he didn't yet understand. The following night, rain lashed against the glass walls of Reed Enterprises, drumming like a warning across the city. Emily pushed her cart through the empty 27th floor, muttering her new motto under her breath. No more disasters, no more wet shoes, no more mistakes. She had survived 3 nights without incident, and for her, that was a miracle. The halls smelled faintly of polish, the marble floors gleamed, and the silence made her heart steady, until a voice broke it. Alexander Reed's voice. She didn't see him at first. He was in one of the executive offices, the door left ajar, his commanding tone slicing through the stillness. "If we can't deliver numbers by Monday, I'll be rethinking leadership in this department. Excuses don't keep the company alive." Emily froze. She had planned to skip that office until later, but if she did, she'd have to return, and Linda would grill her about unfinished rounds. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her bucket and cloth. "Quiet in, quiet out," she whispered to herself. She nudged the door open carefully. Alexander stood near the window, his back to her, his phone pressed to his ear. His posture was sharp, rigid, like a blade forged for command. Emily tiptoed inside, clutching the bucket tightly, but nerves made her clumsy. As she shifted backward, her shoulder brushed the door. It groaned loudly, swinging wider. Alexander turned. Emily's stomach dropped. His gaze landed on her, those dark, unreadable eyes catching her like a net. Startled, her grip loosened. The bucket slipped from her hands. In an instant, soapy water arced through the air and crashed onto the floor, splattering across his polished shoes and the hem of his tailored suit. Silent. Emily's breath hitched. No, not again, not him. Her body moved before her brain did. She dropped to her knees, frantically blotting at his Italian leather shoes with the rag. "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry, sir, whoever you are. I didn't mean, holy water, vinegar, soap, baking soda, anything. I can fix this." Her hands trembled, spreading suds across the floor instead of cleaning it. Her voice cracked under panic. 6 months of salary, that's probably what those cost, right? I'll pay it off, or I'll work overtime, or, oh no, I'm babbling, aren't I? She dared to look up. Alexander Reed, feared CEO, man of steel reputation, was staring at her. But instead of rage, instead of cold dismissal, instead of the thunder she expected, there was something else, the faintest curve of his lips, a smile. Emily blinked. "You're smiling. Oh no, I hit you harder than I thought. Did I break your brain?" Alexander let out a low laugh, a sound so rare, so alien to his world, it startled him as much as her. He lowered his phone slowly, ending the call without a word, and said softly, "It's all right." "All right," Emily squeaked. "Your shoes are swimming in soap and you look like a puddle victim. That's not all right." "They're just shoes," Alexander replied. "Just shoes?" Emily repeated, staring at him as if he'd spoken in another language. "These probably cost more than my rent for 3 months. Don't lie. Look at the stitching. That's like European, fancy European." Alexander tilted his head, watching her frantic energy. "And I can buy another pair." Emily froze, rag dripping in her hands. "You're serious? You're not going to fire me? Or yell? Or, I don't know, banish me to cleaning the basement forever?" "You're not fired," he said simply. Her jaw dropped. She stood, wringing the rag nervously. "Okay, just to be clear, this isn't some weird psychological test, right? You're not waiting for me to leave so you can call security and put a big red X over my name?" For the first time in years, Alexander's chest shook with quiet amusement. No tests, no security. Emily exhaled so hard it echoed. "Wow, you are much nicer than the rumors." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Rumors? Oh, I mean, nothing bad," she stammered. "Just that the CEO, Mr. Reed, is, terrifying, demanding, the kind of man who makes interns cry by sneezing too loud." He bit back another smile. "And you believe that?" "Well, I haven't met him," Emily admitted, "but if I did, I definitely wouldn't dump a bucket of water on his shoes. That would be career suicide. Alexander studied her, the irony burning in his chest. She had no idea. Emily shuffled backward toward the door, still babbling. Anyway, I should go before I break something else. Thanks for not firing me. Seriously, sir, you're kind. Different. She disappeared into the hallway, cart squeaking behind her, leaving suds on the floor and a storm inside Alexander Reed. He stood in silence, water soaking into leather, his reflection fractured in the puddle at his feet. For the first time in decades, someone had looked straight through him, not the CEO, not the untouchable billionaire, not the man the city feared, but just a man caught in a ridiculous, messy accident. And instead of anger, he felt alive. When the elevator doors closed around Emily a few minutes later, she pressed her back against the wall, her heart still hammering. What kind of executive laughs when you destroy his $1,000 shoes? Who was that man? Neither of them knew it, but the puddle on the polished floor had washed open something far deeper than either expected. A storm had been set in motion, one that would bind their lives tighter with every passing night. The building was hushed, as if it too had fallen asleep. Midnight painted long shadows across the marble floors of Reed Enterprises, and Emily pushed her cleaning cart down the dim hallway, humming quietly to herself. She stopped outside the staff break room to sip water, then noticed it again. That forgotten piano tucked in the corner, half covered with a plastic sheet, keys yellowed with age. For 3 nights she had walked past it, pretending it didn't whisper to her, but tonight, something drew her closer. Maybe it was the melody still echoing in her mind from the music box. Maybe it was the storm of confusion she carried since the shoe incident. Why that tall, sharp-eyed executive hadn't fired her on the spot. Why he'd smiled when no one else ever had. Emily peeled the cover from the piano, sat gingerly on the bench, and placed her trembling fingers on the keys. She expected discord, but when she pressed, a soft, slightly out-of-tune note rang through the silence. Her eyes fluttered closed. Without thinking, her hands began to play. The melody poured out, note by note, the same haunting tune from the music box. She didn't remember learning it, yet her fingers moved as though guided by something older than memory itself. The sound filled the empty room, rich and aching, tugging at something deep inside her. She whispered to herself, "Why does this feel like home?" She didn't notice the figure standing just outside the door. Alexander Reed had come down to the lower floors again, restless, searching for excuses. He had meant only to glance through HR reports, but the sound stopped him cold. The melody. Their melody. His heart pounded as he stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. Through the narrow crack in the door, he saw her, Emily, bathed in the glow of the flickering light, her face soft with concentration, her fingers flowing across the keys as though she'd been born to play that song. For a man who had built his empire on logic and control, this was unbearable. How could she know the melody? How could she play it so perfectly when she had no reason to remember? Unless... Alexander pushed the door wider. Emily startled, nearly leaping off the bench. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean, if it's against the rules, I'll stop right now." Alexander raised a hand, his voice low, almost gentle. "Don't stop." Emily blinked at him, her cheeks flushing pink. "You were listening?" "Yes." His eyes softened. "And you play beautifully." She laughed nervously, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Not really. It's just, I don't know why, but this song feels like it's part of me, like my hands remember it, even though my mind doesn't." Alexander stepped closer, his gaze burning into her. "Where did you learn that song?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting away. "At the orphanage where I grew up, there was a piano. One of the staff taught me the basics, but this specific song, I can't remember ever being taught it, I just know it." She gave a small, self-conscious shrug. Strange, right? Every muscle in Alexander's body tightened. He had been that boy. He had held that box. He had once played that same melody for a girl who laughed at his clumsy stories, a girl who called him Josh. But Emily didn't recognize him, not yet. He forced a smile, concealing the storm inside. Strange, but beautiful. There was a long silence. Emily searched his face as though she were trying to place him. For a moment, her eyes narrowed, like a memory hovered just beyond reach. Then she smiled shyly and gestured to the empty space beside her on the bench. "Do you play?" Alexander hesitated. He hadn't touched a piano in years, not since childhood. But tonight, his carefully built walls felt fragile. He sat beside her, the wood creaking under his weight. Emily grinned. "All right then. Alex from maintenance, show me what you've got." He chuckled softly at her teasing, placed his fingers on the keys, and began a simple melody he remembered from long ago. Emily joined in almost instantly, weaving harmony into his tune. The sound was imperfect, but together it became something more, something alive. When the last note faded, Emily leaned back, breathless. "Wow, we play well together. It's like our styles match." "They do," Alexander murmured, staring at her. Emily laughed, embarrassed, and then added softly, "Do you ever get that weird feeling you've met someone before, even if you haven't? Like déjà vu, but stronger?" Alexander's pulse quickened. "Yes." She nodded slowly, her voice trembling with honesty. "That's how I feel around you." For once, Alexander Reed, the man who never faltered, was speechless. He should have told her the truth right then, that he wasn't a janitor, that he wasn't just Alex, that he was Alexander Reed, CEO, and more importantly, that he was Josh, the boy who once promised he'd come back for her. But fear gripped him. If he revealed everything, would she recoil like all the others? Would she see only the billionaire, not the boy she once knew? So he swallowed the truth, even as it burned his throat. Emily stood, smoothing her uniform. "Well, I should finish before Linda checks and finds me slacking off. But thank you, Alex, for not laughing at me, for listening." He rose too, watching her gather her cart. "Emily?" She turned, curious. His words caught, strangled between confession and silence. At last he said only, "You play beautifully. Don't ever stop." Emily smiled softly. "I won't." She disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps fading. Alexander stood in the break room, staring at the piano, the melody still ringing in his ears. For the first time in years, he felt alive. But with life came risk, and a secret he knew couldn't remain buried much longer. He pressed his hand against the piano's worn wood and whispered, barely audible, "Millie." But Emily was already gone. Emily had been pulled onto an unusual daytime cover shift. Jessica was out sick, Linda was anxious, and the executive levels were non-negotiable, spotless. She'd never been this high before. The elevator doors parted on quiet carpet and hushed artwork, a museum of power where even the air seemed expensive. Floor-to-ceiling glass held a winter-pale Boston. Sunlight slid along the conference room's polished table like a blade. "Room 3A first," Linda had said, pressing a key card into her hand. Quick, discreet, invisible. Invisible. Emily pushed her cart down the corridor, humming under her breath to settle her nerves. The plaque read 3A. The door stood a finger's width open. Voices rolled out, measured, decisive, the cadence of people who were used to being right. She meant to come back later. She meant to skip it, to be safe. But the little voice that had carried her through 100 hard days said, "Do the hard thing now. Be brave now." She nudged the door with her hip and slipped inside. 12 men in dark suits turned as one. At the head of the table, a man rose. Emily's small world cracked on a silent hinge. The breath left her body like a pulled thread. Alex. But not Alex. The man at the head of the table wore the same face and the same dark eyes, but everything else was different. His posture iron straight, his presence heavy as an oath. He didn't look like a maintenance tech. He looked like gravity decided to wear a suit. "Numbers for Q4, he was saying, and then he saw her. The room paused, as if the ventilation had stopped, as if even the city below was leaning in. Her hands fumbled for the bucket, for the cloth, for anything that made sense. The bucket struck the floor with a hollow clang that echoed off glass and money. In the stunned quiet that followed, she watched. The truth flood across the polished table faster than water. Alex wasn't Alex. He was Alexander Reed, the CEO. Heat climbed her neck, panic a bright ring around her throat. She didn't drop the bucket this time. She set it down with terrible care, as if gentleness could unwrite the last 3 seconds. Someone at the table cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed," a man tried, eager to glue the moment back together. "We can—" "Excuse us," Alexander said without looking away from her. The room obeyed. Leather chairs scraped softly. Voices retreated. The glass door clicked shut behind the last suit, and the two of them were alone in a cathedral of consequence. He took a step toward her. "Emily, don't." The word was small and made of knives. "Don't say my name like you didn't just erase it." He stopped. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked unsure, the precision of him unspooling by inches. "I was going to tell you." "When?" She laughed. It sounded like glass in a sink. "Before or after I finished cleaning your empire. He flinched. "I wanted—" He faltered, then tried again. "I wanted you to see me, not the headline, not the money." "I did see you," she said, voice shaking. "That was the problem." Silence opened between them, wide and bright as the view. The music box melody that had followed her like a faithful dog felt suddenly cruel, a lovely trick with teeth. A memory fluttered just out of reach, braids, attic dust, a boy's grin, but the present was a hammer. She wiped at her eyes with the heel of her hand, furious with herself for crying in front of him. "You lied to me," she whispered. He swallowed. "I hid. There's a difference." "From what?" She took a step back and the cart's wheel squeaked in muffled protest. "From being who you are? Or from letting me be who I am around it?" He looked for one raw second like a man at the edge of a cliff who finally looked down. "From losing something I didn't even have the right to want." The room tilted. There he was. The Lex, who listened by the piano, who laughed when she, panic babble, promised holy water for his shoes. The Alex who had asked her to play again. The problem was that Alex didn't exist. Alexander did. Emily's mouth opened around 100 responses and closed on all of them. She set the cloth on the cart, turned, and reached for the door with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Emily," he said, and her name was a plea. "Don't go like this." She stopped with her palm on the steel. "There's no elegant way to go," she said without turning. "Just the honest one." She pulled the door open and walked into the corridor, into the elevator, into the lobby where the receptionist looked up with a question she couldn't afford to answer. At Linda's desk, the resignation form looked like any other handout. Sign here, date, return your badge, turn in your key card. She did, the pen dragging a little where her hand trembled. Linda said her name twice before she looked up. "Are you sure?" Linda asked, voice softer than Emily had ever heard it. "Yes," Emily said. "I made a mistake." Outside, the air bit her cheeks. The city had no idea something had broken. She moved through its bustle like a ghost who wasn't ready to haunt anything. On the bus home, she didn't open the music box. She kept her hands in fists until her nails marked half moons in her palms. 2 months passed. They didn't drift so much as grind, days pushing themselves forward like stubborn furniture. Emily found work at a community center in the North End, teaching piano to kids who were all elbows and wonder. They came with mismatched gloves and fierce hunger in their eyes. She fed them scales and small victories. The room was always a little too cold, the keys a little too out of tune, and yet when a child found middle C without looking, the world righted itself by half an inch. At night she told herself she was fine. She was not fine. The melody would find her in dishwater, in the hallway, in the soft dark before sleep, and her chest would answer yes, yes, I remember, to a question she could not name. Across the city, Alexander wore his days like armor and his nights like penance. Meetings multiplied, margins tightened. He spoke the language of leverage until it tasted like cardboard. When the building finally slept, he found himself in the break room again, a giant collapsed into an ordinary chair, staring at the piano as if the wood might confess something. He touched the keys sometimes and played 2 bars of the song before stopping, breath snagging on bar 3 like a snag in a sweater that would unravel if he pulled. Margaret watched him with the wary tenderness of someone who had kept another's calendar and secrets for a decade and a half. She placed an envelope on his desk one evening, gold and uninvited. "Throw it out," he said. "It's a charity gala," she answered. "Arts for Boston, money for music programs, orphanages." The word found the one place in him that wasn't bricked over. He sat up. "Where?" "Harrison Gallery. Saturday. Small. Earnest. You could breathe there." He went because breathing had become something he remembered rather than did. The gallery was more heart than square footage. Paintings hung shoulder to shoulder like second chances. People milled with paper cups and imperfect hair. A piano waited in the corner, polished as well as small donations allowed. He was halfway to the exit with a polite check written when he heard it. Not the song at first. A warm-up scale, a careful chord, someone testing the road. Then the opening line of the melody like a key turning. His blood moved faster than his body. He stepped through the small crowd and saw her. Emily sat at the piano in a navy dress that made her look like the eyed of a midnight secret. Her hands moved like they'd been waiting all day to touch something that knew them back. She didn't see him. She saw only the notes, each one a rung on a ladder out of some private drowning. The last chord fell into silence. People clapped, small, sincere thunder. She stood, smiling her thanks, and that was when their eyes crashed into each other. It wasn't a movie moment. No swell of soundtrack, no spinning room, just 2 people who had learned how to live with holes in their chests, realizing the holes were the same shape. She stepped back from the bench. He didn't move. Somewhere, a volunteer asked him if he wanted a cookie. No, he did not want a cookie. He wanted the one thing the world had taught him he could never buy, a beginning that wasn't built on a lie. Emily slipped along the gallery wall toward a quieter corner hung with small watercolors. He followed at a distance that wouldn't frighten a stray cat. "Hi," she said when he stopped a few feet away. Her voice held steadiness on scaffolding. "Hi," he said, and everything sophisticated in him failed. "You're playing for gas money and kids' snacks," she said lightly, and because they asked. He nodded once. The truth crowded his mouth. He had rehearsed a dozen apologies, but none accounted for the particular wound of being seen and then mistrusting the seeing. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and it was not a performance. It came from whatever part of a person is closest to the bone. "I thought hiding would keep what was real safe. I was wrong." She studied him as if there were words written on his face and she was deciding whether to read them. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be angry and miss you at the same time." He closed his eyes. The admission was a mercy he didn't deserve. When he opened them, the room had not changed, but the distance between and them had. "Would you let me try again?" he asked softly, without the mask. Her laugh was small and tired and real. "Maybe," she said, "but you don't get to choose the terms this time." He nodded. "Good." Silence sat with them, not hostile, not friendly, possible. Someone across the room started a new piece, cheerful and clumsy. He looked at her hands, at the small callus on her right ring finger where she pressed the keys too hard when she was nervous. "Emily," he said, and her name wasn't a plea this time. It was a promise that asked permission to be made. She glanced at the door, at the night beyond it. "I kept your coat," she said. "I meant to return it." "Keep it," he answered. "Please." They stood among the watercolors of boats and birds and skies that couldn't decide their weather. He didn't try to take her hand. She didn't offer it. The shock of the reveal had passed. The suspicion had not. What lived between them now was thinner and fiercer, the bare beginning of trust, a match cupped against wind. Outside, the storm that hadn't happened earlier finally dragged its sleeve across the city. Rain pressed its palms to the gallery's old windows and stayed there, listening. Neither of them knew it yet, but the song would ask for everything.